Welcome to another edition of One More Light with me, Val Kleinhans, where we break the stigma and have conversations surrounding mental health and all of its aspects. One particular aspect of it that interested me, because I've just had some experiences back in the day that I've tried to make sense of as I've gotten older, and I haven't quite done that. Maybe Dr. Quincee Gideon can help because she is a psychologist specializing in religious trauma. That's one of many things that she does, but religious trauma is her thing, one of the things. And I wanted to talk with her a lot about that today. Dr. Quincee, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm so glad that you're here because I'm hoping you can make sense of this. But I guess we should start from the very beginning. What inspired you to study psychology at all?
This will probably be a surprise to exactly zero of us, but I grew up in a very rigid religion. And
Mm,
part of my life path kind of sent me down the missionary route. And so I traveled a lot overseas and worked with a lot of NGOs. They were all religious, and then eventually started my own nonprofit. And so I was in these really traumatized parts of the world where there was a lot of rebel warfare. A
mm,
lot of kids were suffering. Whole communities had been devastated by war. And the hug and pray method was not sufficient for this amount of trauma. And so what started out as a real interest in more of like the social work parts, like how can we get people resources, ended up turning into a master's and then a doctorate in psychology, just so that I could figure out how to treat trauma, how to address trauma, that I was encountering all of the time.
yeah. Well, I read on your website, I think you spent at least some time in Africa, or is this kind of what we're referring to here? What
Yeah,
you've seen
yeah, yeah.
there, or
I
where else in
was
the world?
It was mostly sub-Saharan Africa, so Eastern and Central Africa. I was in different countries and different communities on and off for about 10 years.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
How did you realize that like hug and pray wasn't working for them?
Well, I think that if anyone is out there that has had any sort of traumatic event, you understand that trauma is a neurological and physical experience of feeling like you've lost control. And then in the aftermath, your body continues to feel like you're back in that trauma. And so it was very evident from the jump that
Mm.
there were things that we could do, but that there was a religious perspective that was really kind of restricting what we could do with these people, what we could offer as far as support. And that's when I felt like I needed more education to even be able to argue that point with, the higher ups of these organizations that I was working for.
Okay. What was it that you were wanting to do that you felt like, these people were not getting? What
Uh,
that religion wouldn't allow them to have?
Anything.
Wow.
So so sex education,
Ah.
gender-based violence training, understanding attachment patterns and resources that could be used
Mm.
in indigenous communities in that area. Really restricting the 1950s version of Christianity that had been proselytized in those areas, and it kind of stopped growing, like the faith stopped evolving, and it was a very
Mm.
old school, restrictive, gendered understanding of God and religion and faith and suffering. So really on all fronts, I felt like we were being held back in some way, and that bothered me. It
Mm.
bothered me that it seemed like surely there's something that we can do about all of this trauma. Surely our programs should be trauma informed. Surely all of this money that we're pumping into these communities can be a little bit more effective.
Yeah.
But I really kept hitting a lot of roadblocks, and mostly that was because I didn't know how to argue my points well enough,
Yeah.
because I didn't have the education quite yet.
Okay, so they wanted facts, they wanted statistics, they wanted documentation in journals, what have you. That's what made even if you brought all of that to them, do you think that would have changed their minds?
No, and it didn't.
No. Okay.
Yeah,
So
and it
now we
didn't.
get to the point where you're like, I'm gonna make this my own mission, and I'm gonna do me.
Yeah, so I started a nonprofit, but in my doctorate, I went to my clinical psychology program was housed inside of a seminary.
Mm.
So it was APA approved and it was a legitimate, school for psychology, but it was also a school for theology. And I picked that on purpose because at that point in my life, I was really interested in making sense of human suffering. Like, how do we
Mm,
reconcile that with a God that says that they are loving and want the best for us as followers? And so I really kind of stepped into that at this school. If you are in the psychology program, you have to get a master's in theology. And so I was kind of getting this co-education along the way. And it was really for the intent of I probably trying to break some of the norms of what was happening in these really religious nonprofit organizations in the churches that we were raising money with. And I felt like that question came up a lot. And there was a whole lot of my own shoulders kind of raising, like, shrug. I don't know why this sort of suffering
mm.
happens. So really that's kind of where the education started for me.
Yeah, that's kind of I ask the same questions, and I still sometimes ask the same question, like,
As you should.
why is it? Yeah, yeah. Well, particularly when it came to the more fire and brimstone types
Hmm.
of just environments where I was just shocked by some of the things that I saw. I mean, I was raised non-denomination, Bible based Christian.
Hmm.
And my mom thought that it would be fun to send me away to summer camp for a week with my youth group. And I was like, cool, that's great. Now, she had no idea. She thought that this was mainly still Bible based. I don't think she understood like how fire and brimstone this place ended up
Hmm.
really being, because there was a leader, and of course, it's a man every time. I don't know why that is, but
Okay.
it's always a man. And he's telling a group of preteens and teenagers. Nobody in this room is older than maybe 17 that's attending this camp, telling them how horrible they are, how they've sinned, how they must repent, blah, 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 blah. They're dirty, they're horrible. And I'm looking around at all these kids crying and sobbing. And even at 15, 16, when I went to this camp, I'm like, this just does not make any sense. Why am I, the 15-year-old, comforting the girl next to me and saying,
Hmm.
it's okay, when there's an adult, a grown man who we're supposed to respect and, listen to, causing their pain? He's obviously upsetting them. How is it that this is okay and they're doing it in the name of religion?
Well,
Now,
and I will tell you that your story is one that I think a lot of people tell, but it shows how not indoctrinated you were at the time. Because those of us
yes.
that grew up in that space and those of us that were used to giving testimonies of our sinfulness from the age that we could talk, and we grew up in environments where, I've never seen any other community that's more obsessed with genitals than the evangelical, like, fundamentalist
Yeah.
church, you know? So
It,
when you grow up in those things, the girl that was like crying on your shoulder, if she grew up in that, she's not thinking, what in the world is going on here? Why are these people trying to scare us?
yeah.
She's thinking, I really am that terrible, and I really am headed towards the pits of hell if I continue to just be me.
Oh my gosh, and that was so painful to watch. So, so painful to watch, and I was like, "Listen, we have all made mistakes," and I tried to phrase it in, terms that maybe she could understand. I was like, "Listen, at least we've been hearing that we can be forgiven, right?" And
Hmm.
then and they're like, "Okay." And then and then she kinda, like, calmed down a little bit, but it was just so I could not make sense of that. And you have seen all aspects of environments like that.
Yes.
Why do you think we have these elders and these leaders in these church doing these things? Are they doing it because they genuinely believe in the cause, or are they doing it because I just feel like exerting power today?
It's always both.
Mm,
There's never going to be sort of a clean cut way in which we might be able to define these groups by, like, oh, they knew it the whole time and they were just absolutely cruel in, how they could know that they're hurting people and they can continue to do it. It's always some mix. And if we're thinking about a spectrum of experiences, we're on one end of the spectrum, it's folks that know that they're causing harm and doing it anyway. And on the other end of the spectrum, it's people that truly believe this stuff and their families have for generations, or they've had a really vulnerable period of their life where they felt like they had some sort of conversion experience, and that really emotionally puts a nail in the coffin, right,
Mm,
of their belief system. If we're thinking about this along a spectrum, everyone that's in leadership in these spaces or are participants in these groups are somewhere along that spectrum, but they're going to have a little bit of a mix of both.
interesting. How can you tell that somebody has experienced religious trauma, or maybe they're currently in the depths of it?
I think that happens in different ways. I'm really interested in rigidity and how someone has a hard time taking in feedback, how they might argue or defend a point, especially around them being pretty terrible humans when I don't of me, when their relationships are really suffering because everyone's trying to follow rules instead of connecting with one another. And so of course
Mm,
their marriage is going to suffer, and of course your relationship with your children are going to suffer. Like all of this sort of suffering happens as a result of trying very hard to follow the rigid rules of a religion rather than being more interested in the human experience and in connecting, which um, what do I know? But in my opinion, that's exactly what all of this is about. What good
yeah.
is life if we're not connecting?
I don't I question the same thing. I mean, for years was brought up in that same church, and you hear, homosexuality is a sin, blah, 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 blah. Now, I am a heterosexual just because I am, but I've had friends that are gay, and another question that I kept having was, why is it like I would become friends with these people before I even knew about their personal life or, anything. A- And I was like, wait a second, why am I supposed to follow this rule that I can't be friends with these people if these people are here and created by somebody who I've been told is incredibly loving
Mm-hmm. Is
and
all loving. Yeah.
would be welcoming? That's another thing that just made absolutely no sense.
Well, I mean, I think we can put it in the category of why are women treated the way that they are?
Yeah.
Why, is sex so regulated? Why is like the gendered presentation of someone so regulated in these spaces? And I had a wise friend once tell me that if you can control someone's sex life and who they have sex with, you can control everything. And not that
Really?
we are just sexual beings, but every single person on this planet has the same sexual drive, or most would fall in that category. Or if they don't have that sexual drive, they're perhaps identifying themselves in opposition to that sexual drive, like asexual folks. So, in my opinion, this is one of the ways that you can control people. If you can
Hmm.
control who has sex before marriage, then you're going to control marriages, you're going to control the family. You're going to keep people in that religion longer because they're going to raise their kids that way. I mean, really, it's,
Hmm.
in my opinion, it's around control and the very daunting task of admitting that there may not be such a dire consequence to having a human experience. If you admit that, then you also have to admit that all of the fire and brimstone sermons and all of the ways that you've scared people in order to give money to your church, and all of the ways that you have funded all of these mission trips and you've begged people, and they've really overextended themselves financially to support this church. I mean, really, you have to be accountable to those things if you start admitting that maybe that's not the point of all of this. And so I think at
Hmm.
some point we get to a point of no return, or in psychology, we talk about sunk cost, and that's the psychological experience of investing a lot into these belief systems, into these communities, into the way in which you've raised your family, all of those sort of money. Like we invest a lot of resources, and at some point, it becomes psychologically too difficult to admit that we were wrong all of that time because we
Wow.
have invested so much.
That is so insightful. And now the so many things click now. Oh my gosh. Well, so something else I wanted to ask. I've mentioned the Christian church quite a bit already, but does religious trauma apply to any religion?
Yeah, I have a rather broad definition of religious trauma. I don't think that trauma is any hard thing that you've ever been through. I think trauma is something that makes you question your safety and ability to survive in a
Mm,
certain circumstance. And so when you add trauma to a religious environment, which the religious community is meant to be the safest place, right? That's what they tout. That's part of their byline, right? You're safe here.
mhm,
You can be yourself here. God wants you here. When that is a part of what you're saying, people get, and then they come into that space and they're told that they're going to hell for being gay, or they can't have sex with people who are perfectly safe to have sex with, and they can't relate to people in a way that shows human emotion, because that's evidence that you don't have
mm,
enough God in your life. I mean, when you start doing things like that, you start really adding to a sense of people are going to lose everything. They're going to lose this faith. They're going to lose their family. They're going to lose their communal resources if they don't take your word for it, if they don't believe everything that the religion is selling. And so it really ups the ante. I think that's one way that religious trauma can happen, is when trauma happens inside of the community. But I also think that religious trauma is when you drag God into the trauma narrative. So God is going to send you to hell if you fill in the blank. That's
mm.
trauma. That is, and you've got the supposed ruler of the universe that is so hateful and so spiteful
Yeah.
that God is going to send you to an eternity in hell. That's traumatic, especially when humans are the ones defining who goes to hell and who doesn't, and the different interpretations
Mm.
of that, and the way that let's in the Christian church the Bible was created, and the Mormon church the way in which the Book of Mormon was written was full of freaking trauma, and it's full of human definitions of things. But when we take that stuff to heart, now we're really worried that the God of the universe doesn't only hate us, but is willing to be separated from us forever by sending us to hell. That's
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah, and that's scary because you don't want to go through that perceived abandonment if you're told that this is what you have to like latch onto for your
Totally.
survival. If that's,
Totally.
shoved down your throat and oh yeah, yeah. So what are some of the best ways that we can work through religious trauma?
I think just taking a trauma approach is the most helpful thing. I think if you're a part of a cult or a very rigid religion,
Mm,
it's helpful
mhm,
to find someone that knows religious trauma and cult recovery, because there's a little bit of some different dynamics that go on that might be hard for like another person to understand unless you're kind of studied on these things. But trauma informed care, I think getting into some sort of environment where there's a professional that can help lead the way. When trauma happens and when we don't recover kind of on our own, our brains are holding on to that experience, and when we're triggered, it feels like that experience is happening right here in this moment, not 10 years ago, not last week, in this moment. And our brains cannot differentiate whether it's happening in this moment or it's a memory. And so when that stuff happens, now you're just recreating a trauma pattern or a trauma
mm,
narrative. And it's not likely that you're going to be able to get out of that without someone kind of coming in and being like, this is your brain, take a deep breath. This is what we're going to do. How's your self care? Abysmal, not surprising. The church
mm.
tells you that you can't take care of yourself, so
Yeah.
let's like start practicing that. Oh, you have some guilt and some shame over taking care of yourself. You feel like that's super selfish. Let's work through that. Oh, you
Mm,
feel like you've lost 30 years of your life and perhaps your children because you raised them in an environment that is kind of hateful. Let's grieve. Let's talk through that. So there's so many different parts of overcoming religious trauma, in my opinion, finding some professional setting to do that in. And I know that therapy isn't always an affordable thing for folks, but there are religious trauma groups. We have one at my practice. There are kind of groups out there that meet, like peer support groups, and they really are meant to kind of help someone that's not as far along in the journey along, while the veterans are there to kind of support and point out some things along the way.
Yeah, and to add to that, I was watching some of your reels earlier today, and one of them talks about the importance of finding therapy outside of the church. And
Yes.
I, you walk me through this and correct me if I'm wrong, but the message that I got was it's important to do that because you're not still stuck in that same environment that caused the trauma to begin with. We're trying to overcome that. We're getting different perspectives, different ideas. Is that
Mhm.
true? And can you maybe add to that?
Yeah, it's at its most essential is a conflict of interest.
Mm,
So, as therapists, we are meant to think of the overall well being of a person. And if I identify as a, sort of stringent Christian that believes that the patient sitting in front of me is headed to hell if they continue to question things, if they continue to talk about their religious environment with venom, right? Because that's
mm,
a lot of what trauma does to us.
yeah.
Um, if you are sitting in the therapist seat and you believe that there's going to be eternal damnation for the person sitting across from you, it does not matter how open minded, how unbiased you believe that you are not unbiased.
Mm,
And there is going to be an internal pull to pull you back into the faith system, because if you don't, you're literally sending them to the pits of hell, or admitting that your faith system might have some problems with it. Both of those are typically intolerable. And we can do a
mm.
whole lot of mental dances around this, and we can really try to talk ourselves into this. But at its most essential, that is a conflict of interest. Because there are deep emotional ties to getting someone back into an environment that has traumatized them. And so you really got to find someone maybe that's had that same experience, that maybe used to identify themselves with a certain religion. But if that person still believes that that is the only way into an eternal heaven, you have got the wrong person, and you have got to find
Mm,
someone else. And in my opinion, I no longer disclose any of my beliefs, because what do they matter? They don't matter at all, because it's mine and you get to have yours. But I
yeah.
will disclose that, right? If someone comes in and wants to start therapy with me, I think it's a perfectly reasonable question to say, where do you stand? Do you hold these beliefs to be the only way into heaven, or the only way to live life, as the only way to have a moral compass? And if that's true, I there's no way that I can feel safe in this therapeutic environment. And so that's a reasonable question to ask, and you should ask it if you're going to therapy for religious trauma.
Yeah, because it's not pure intention whenever you're going to somebody who may or may not still be affiliated with that church. I mean, you don't want that person that's still affiliated because they could be trying to pull you back in, or they're not looking for your best self-interest. They're looking for the best interest of the church, and that's to continue to get followers.
Yeah, and I don't know if any sort of religious based therapist would admit that. So,
Mm,
and I'm not in the game of trying to get them to admit that. I just think that we all have biases, and those all come up in therapy, and we're constantly needing to address which ones are ones that are flexible enough that I could hold this client's full experience, and which of those am I just really restricted in. And if I'm really restricted, I'm probably not the person for them.
yeah, got it. I read an interesting statistic that said 66% of Americans between the ages of 23 and 30, and this was from an article that came out like a year ago, said they stopped attending church on a regular basis for at least 1 year or more. And I had some thoughts about that. Do you think that maybe that signals we have more Americans admitting they have encountered religious trauma and they just don't want to be part of that environment anymore? Are you seeing that reflected in your own practice where more and more people are coming to you for help with this?
Yeah, I think that I have a couple of different answers to this. First of all, that is a statistic that is touted in so many churches because we do call it the Great Flight. That there is a
Mm,
generation of folks that are leaving the church because the church is not showing up in the same way that they, promised that they would. Right. So this is something that is used in churches to basically finger wag and say, see, if you don't stay connected to church, and if you don't stay in, reading your Bible, and if you don't stay in a committed relationship with God, then the devil will step in and tempt you and you'll leave. And then what? You can't expect your marriages to be good. You can't expect relationships to be successful. You'll totally ruin all of your children that you have, right? There's these big
wow.
stakes at leaving the church. So that statistic is actually used to scare people from leaving or showing any sort of dissent. But
Mm,
the reason that I think that that is happening, that there is this kind of great flight from specifically evangelical Christianity, but I think also we're seeing it in Mormonism. We're seeing it in Jehovah's Witnesses. We're seeing it in a lot of different places. I think that that is a testament to hopefully some of the work that we're doing out here to just make mental health issues a little bit more talkable.
right.
And as we do that, I think people are seeing things like on Instagram and they're kind of like having a highlight, like a aha moment of, oh my gosh, that's exactly my story. And oh my God, I do dream about hell a lot. And oh my God, I
Yeah.
I do live this really restricted life. And how come everyone else isn't dying when
Mm,
they're having a human experience like I've been told that I would? So I think that there's some questioning. I think we're also think what you will about social media. I love the internet because I think that there are less walls to hide behind.
mm,
And I think that when you're connecting with someone in New York City and you're from a small little town in Texas, and suddenly there's people that feel the same way as you or have had similar experiences or, identify in the same way that you do, suddenly your world is so much less small and sad
yes.
and
Yes.
helpless. And I just think that in general, that's bringing a lot to the table,
Hmm.
as far as people having more information to make their decisions based on. I think that, as far as my specialty of religious trauma, I was doing this for 10 years and I've only recently, probably in the last 2 or 3 years, started talking about it.
Mm,
Not because I wasn't proud of it, but simply because no one was Googling religious trauma therapists near me. I mean, it just wasn't
mm,
a thing that you talked about. Now, so many of the people that were coming to me had so much religious trauma, and so many of them grew up in these very cultic environments. But that wasn't necessarily the like headline on my website because
mm,
that's not how people were identifying themselves in that season. But I think in the last couple of years, I think I made one post a couple of years ago that went viral. And the part of it that made it go viral is that I talked about my previous marriage being full of religious trauma.
oh,
And
wow.
that like blew up because I think people were like, yes, that's me. Oh my gosh, yes. And then I started talking about it more. And now, I really sort of took a step back and was like, oh, literally every single one of my patients is a religious trauma survivor. So I should
Yes.
start talking about this more. And also, therapists aren't trained in how to deal with this and how to understand really trauma inducing spirituality practices that really have a mental health outcome. We're not taught that in school. There's not a lot of trainings out there.
Hmm.
And so that's been another part, is just to kind of grow a community of practitioners that also do this work that need a little support. And maybe we could teach each other something.
Absolutely. Is that
Yeah.
what's next for you? Or are you looking to grow and just keep having fun
Yeah.
with what you're doing?
Yeah. The last couple of months, we launched a therapist training program for religious trauma and cult recovery. And it is literally my favorite thing that I've ever done professionally ever. We have a consultation group that meets once a month, and just getting to sit in a Zoom room with other practitioners all over the country and even in Canada, and getting to hear their experiences. We're working through these things together. We are brainstorming about how to support one another. We're staying connected in between the consultation group. I couldn't ask for something more. And it was what I longed for 10 years ago when I was starting my practice.
Awesome. Is there anything else that we can look forward to from you?
I'll keep talking about cult recovery, and I'll keep talking about religious trauma. I have recorded a couple of episodes in different documentaries that are coming out next year, so that's
Cool.
been really exciting to get to talk about this on a bigger scale. So yeah,
Yeah, look for those. Follow you on Instagram. I know I
yes,
love doing it. Everybody else will love doing that too. That's where we'll get all the updates. Dr. Quincee, thank you so much for walking us through this and thank you for your time.
my pleasure.